Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started here. Welcome. Thank you all so much for logging in. This is our annual One Read panel discussion. This year we're discussing A Gentleman in Moscow by Amor Towles. My name is Stone Underwood. I'm one of the One Read co-chairs. Lauren Williams and Eric Schmeck are also here. We will be working kind of behind the scenes during this discussion. Once we get started, we'll have our video off, so don't be alarmed that we're supposed to do that. I do have a few items of housekeeping for this, and then I'll touch on a couple of programs before I hand it over. So as you can probably tell, only the panelists and the moderator are able to use their microphones and have video. Everyone else is muted to cut out background noise. If you have a question, please feel free to type it in the chat box. You can find your chat box by hovering on your screen, and you'll see chat on the bottom, kind of in the middle. So if you type in a question or a comment there, all of the panelists can see it and we'll be able to answer that way. This discussion will be recorded and we'll have it available in the next day or so on the library's YouTube channel. So you can find that there. I have just a couple of programs that I want to touch on before we get going. We have our flash fiction writing contest. This year the theme is nostalgia. You're going to be able to submit your work of flash fiction, which means 250 words or less. And you can submit that online at oneread.org or in person at any of our locations. And we're accepting entries for that until September 25th. So if you have a story that you want to write and submit, do that soon. We're looking forward to them. The winners will be published in the Columbia Missourian as well as online at oneread.org. And then the winner will receive a bookstore gift certificate as well. We also have a very big program coming up, the Author Talk. You might have heard about it. That is going to be next Tuesday, September 22nd from 7 to 8. And David Lile will chat with the author of our book, Amor Towles. And he'll be asking him some questions of his own. And then also we are taking questions from the community, and you can submit yours at oneread.org. And we'll be having a Q&A session with him. Again, that's next week on September 22nd from 7 to 8. If you want to register for that Zoom link, you can find that at DBRL.org. And so the panel discussion, this is one of our most popular One Read programs year after year. I really enjoy it because it allows us to look at the book from a variety of different angles and perspectives. I want to do a big thank you to all of our panelists who are here with us tonight. Thank you so much for your time. I really look forward to this discussion. I think this is going to be a good one. And I'd also like to say a special thank you to David Lile of KFRU. He moderates this panel every year. And then on top of that, he gets kudos for helping get the One Read program started. He promotes One Read happenings on the air and in the community, and he's a member of our reading panel. So he's part of that group of people that narrows down the list of over 100 books to just 2 that then we allowed the community to vote for it. So thank you so much, David. I will go ahead and mute myself and turn off my video and then hand it over to David to introduce the panelists. We do have one panelist that will join us as soon as he's able to, so you might see him hop on.
All right, thank you, Kat, and I appreciate it. Thanks to Eric, who's helping with the things behind the scene also, and then Lauren and Kat and Kirk, who's been helping out through the arrangement of this. I think they do a great job. If we were in person in the Friends Room, we'd all give them a round of applause like we do usually each year. And I feel honored and privileged to be able to be asked to do this because it is it's one of the times that I really like what's happening with the One Read program. And, it's One Read. We all read the same book, but we all don't experience it the same way. You're going to hear that tonight because in a moment I'm going to tell you who the panelists are, what their backgrounds are, just briefly, and they can expand on this if they want to. I will say this about one of the things that Kat said is that a week from tonight when we do talk to the author, I do hope that a lot of people will submit questions that the library will go through and the co-chairs of One Read. I had an opportunity to record an interview that I'll play back on KFRU on Friday morning with the author, Amor Towles, and I find him to be really engaging. He even takes bad questions and makes something good out of those. And so he will I think he will want to hear questions from those of you who want to participate more so than me, because he's had a chance to talk to me. And as Kat also said, we do have the chat column that we can see. And so if you have any questions that you want to bring up, or just observations, I think observations more than anything to what any of our panelists say, then please share those. And if you want to say, I have participated in every single one of these panel discussions, then put that on the chat column also, because I'll give a shout out to you maybe either during or at the end, because I know that what I've done in the past is I've asked for a show of hands to those who have been in all the panelist discussions, this part of each one read, and I think this is the 19th of these, and some of you have been a part of all 19 of them, and I think that's terrific, and thank you for your support of One Read. All right, so tonight we will be joined by a peer specialist for behavioral health, and he's going to talk about his experiences. He was incarcerated for 23 years, and I'm interested to see what kind of a perspective somebody who's got that background will have of One Read. I am going to venture a guess to say that his incarceration was a little bit different than what the Count's was at the Metropole Hotel in Moscow. We also have an associate professor of Russian studies and someone who directs the graduate studies in Russian. We also have a city council person who works closely with the homeless community here in Columbia and has a great heart for those who are very much challenged in their day-to-day living. And then we also have a licensed clinical psychologist. So we have a lot of backgrounds. As I said, we read this book together. It's called One Read, but we really do experience it differently, and that's why we like this night. I asked a while ago, as we were all getting used to each other and made sure that our technology was working, who wanted to go first in just an overall reaction to the book. And Dr. Chris Lawrence was brave enough to say she would do it. So I'm going to welcome her and let her talk about how the book struck her. She worked for the Cambridge Center for 15 years and started private practice about 15 years ago. She's been studying somatic interventions for anxiety, trauma, and depression as she practices privately as a licensed clinical psychologist. So Dr. Lawrence, welcome. Thank you for your participation. And please, as you start out, tell me what somatic intervention is.
Sure. Thank you, David. So somatic means of the body. And so I work with people and teach them about their nervous system and how their nervous system responds to stress and overwhelm and kind of gets hijacked, and how to unhijack their nervous system. So I believe a lot of mental health symptoms are actually nervous system dysregulation, and that if you can address them from a body perspective instead of a cognitive perspective, you're going to have more success. So I'm also the director of a nonprofit called Heart Space Clinic, and that's the whole purpose of Heart Space, is to educate and treat trauma and overwhelm from a body and nervous system perspective.
So I want you to respond however you want to, but just from what you've said, I do have a first question for you. Did the Count show signs of stress that would have raised alarm if you had known him and were maybe seeing him?
Absolutely, because at one point he almost committed suicide. And, you know, as I read the book, I was certainly interested in how he coped, and how he found meaning. And it's interesting to me that after that moment when his suicide attempt was stopped, he joined the staff of the hotel. And you can see how that then made him a part of a bigger picture and gave a lot of meaning to his life and created a community for him. And, you know, when you look at people who have gone through a traumatic event, one of the most important things that helps them to cope is social support. And so that was such a good decision of his to join as a waiter, because then he was part of the community there and not just a guest.
Thank you. I'm curious as to your other reaction. Can you read this in a way that is not the clinical psychologist side of you?
That's super hard to do. You know, this was the first book that I have read for pleasure in a very, very long time, because I mostly read in my field. So it's hard to put that aside, but I found that I loved the book when the children were involved. Those were my favorite parts. You know, Nina and Sophia brought a lightness and really made the Count show up as he was, which was a very gentle soul. And I was also really struck by the fact that he was essentially a foster parent. And I have worked with many foster and adoptive families, and just, I'm always struck by how those parents step into a role that can be taken away from them at any moment if the biological parent comes back. And they just put their heart out there. And that's exactly what he did. He just put his heart out there and raised this child, even though he didn't know how long she was going to be in his life. And the fact that he was in a community at that point meant that there was this whole village that raised this little girl, the seamstress and the chef and all of those people who were invested in her life. And even though she was missing her mom and her dad, she had a community that was very, very loving towards her. There's one part that I wanted to share that I was really touched by. On the night before she had left Moscow, when Sophia had expressed her distress at what her father wanted her to do, he had attempted to console her with a notion. He had said that our lives are steered by uncertainties, many of which are destructive and even daunting, but that if we persevere and remain generous of heart, we may be granted a moment of supreme lucidity, a moment in which all that has happened to us suddenly comes into focus as a necessary course of events, even as we find ourselves on the threshold of a bold new life that we had been meant to lead all along. I just love that. I just, it's how he made meaning out of I was in the right place at the right time.
Yeah, I like that part that you just read also, and there are other little parts like that the author,
Yeah.
I wonder what his inspiration was for those kinds of insights that he threw in there, because it did add so much to what he was talking about.
Yeah, it sure did. Yeah.
Well, anything else you want to add here right off the bat before I move on? We'll come back, I'm sure.
Yeah, well, I did a little bit of research on him and what he wrote about. And one thing I found really interesting is the structure of the book. And he starts at the day of the arrest and he ends the day that he escapes, or he reunites with Anna. And he does this doubling principle where the next chapter is 2 days later, the next chapter is 5, 10, 3 weeks, 6 weeks, 3 months. So he did this conscious process, and then he did it in reverse. So once he started planning his escape, it was 8 years, 4 years, 2 years, 1 year, 6 month, 3 month, which I think he described it as an accordion. And I just think that's fascinating how he did that.
That is a neat observation that I had missed. So I appreciate you sharing that.
I didn't figure it out. I did some reading and he described it in an interview. So
Dr. Chris Lawrence is with us, and we'll come back and engage her some more. We'll move on. I want to say welcome to Sarah, who has chatted and said this is her first one of these panelist discussions, and we welcome her. And then also we'll get to a question that Pam will have, and we will do that here when we get deeper into our discussion about Russian history. So Dr. Kelly is standing by for that. Next, I want to go to Michael Trapp, though. I don't know who they're going to choose for these panel discussions, and then all of a sudden it's revealed to me, and I thought, wow, city councilman who I know him from that role and from the way that he gives such deep thought into the city's problems, and I thought, well, I have no idea how he's going to respond to a book about a man that's living this life in a hotel where he's got everything basically catered to him. Michael Trapp, thank you so much for your participation. How did this book strike you?
Thank you, David. I really liked it. I thought it moved along really well. I thought Tolles really had some insight into the human condition. I like books where I enjoy the protagonist, and I really like Count Rostov. And I think I was asked to be on this presentation because of my work with the homelessness issue. And 2 of the responses we've done as mutual aid projects are hotel-based shelters. And both as a city council person and as someone who works with homeless folks, I've got to look under the hood, so to speak, as far as how hotels run. And I think Tolles really captured that they're really family operations. Either the ownership sometimes, but often management lives on site. There is this process where you can go from guest to employee. I've seen that happen a number of times. So that all resonated. Now, this is a high-end hotel, and I have less practical experience with that, but I enjoyed those aspects. The part of the book that struck me the most was how much Count Rostov kind of echoed what I see in homeless culture. In Steinbeck, he really captures this in Tortilla Flat, where he explores kind of the struggles of homeless folks who are fighting over these battles of honor, and he raises it to, like the Knights of the Round Table and these battles over a jug of wine or the love of a good woman. And that kind of fighting for your honor, living in the day to day, that's something that the nobility and homeless folks share more so than kind of working class and middle class folks. There was one part that I thought was extremely poignant, and it's in the beginning where he says, like Robinson Crusoe stranded on the Isle of Despair, the Count would maintain his resolve by committing to the business of practicalities. Having dispensed with the dreams of quick discovery, the world's Crusoes seek shelter and a source of fresh water. They teach themselves to make fire from flint. They study their island's topography, its climate, its flora and fauna, all the while keeping their eyes trained for sails on the horizon and footprints in the sand. And that, when the Count gets into the day-to-day struggle of how he's going to manage, that's the world of homelessness, that people are looking for where they're going to sleep tonight, how are they going to get, what are they going to eat, what are they going to drink, how are they going to do the things that they need to do to survive and to have a little bit of escape in their life. And so I think there's a universality that Count Rostov brings that at least resonated with me as a homeless advocate.
So we don't see that. I mean, that was very interesting because I didn't even think of him as having any characteristics that were similar to homelessness, because I thought he's got a home, but he immediately was taken out of his surrounding that he had had for a while, and he had to make a home out of the little attic space that he was given, and he was able to adjust to that. But also expand just a moment, if you would please, more about the sense of I guess, honor or dignity or humanness that even homeless people who are not put up and exiled in a very fancy hotel still exhibit, that you saw fleshed out in the Count.
Even in the beginning of the book where he's in front of the kind of Inquisition and they're questioning him and they ask what kind of business does he do? And that's similar to when we're meeting people, our first question is, what do you do? It's our way of kind of putting people in this box. And homeless folks, some of them work, there is a part of that population, but a lot of them don't. They are people of leisure, and they read and they talk and they get into the social world. And so honor becomes very important for the Count. That kept him, alive, kept him sharp, kept him from falling into this dangerous ennui. It almost took him, was his sense of propriety and honor. And you see that same kind of thing in low-income communities where there are frequently conflicts over respect. You've disrespected me. That's a driver, as I know from a city council person who's looked at crime and violence in the community. Homicide always between people who know each other over a personal beef. And so, from the Count having the dueling pistols on hand, raised in his way to that honor is a life and death thing that you stand up for. That's the same way that people who don't have a lot of things materially, don't have a sense of work for their sense of identity. We all have to find things that give us a reason to get up in the morning and to feel that we matter and to give meaning to our experience. And the day-to-day struggle isn't that. It's the struggle with dignity, with honor, with respect, and ensuring that that's met even with the threat of physical violence.
We see homeless as just a flat description. I mean, we just see them as flat characters, and I don't think we see much else than a homeless person sometimes. A lot of people, you and others, see beyond that, but many of us don't.
Yeah, if you look, Pat, everyone's got a story. They're really fascinating folks. No one gets here by accident or overnight. And when you can get to know them, they're often amazingly well read. You know, frequently they'll read the paper, they'll follow the news and events, they talk about ideas. A lot of folks, they have time to fill, and they fill that with conversation. And they're well worth kind of looking beyond the stereotype and looking for their sense of humanity. And when you come, even as a city council person, when I come with an open heart and a sincerity, they're able to set that aside. And I am, for the most part, one of the folks. I think there's always that level that, you know, it's definitely, when I was before I was on city council, there was that less of a mystique, and I was able to relate to people more fully. But even with my position and them knowing who I am by reputation, we're able to talk person to person and get to know each other.
Well, thank you so much. I'm so glad you're a part of the panel and listening patiently through our first part and waiting for her turn to talk is Dr. Martha Kelly. She is the Associate Professor of Russian Studies and Director of Graduate Studies in Russian. Welcome. We appreciate your participation in this. I'll just ask you a starting question. When you were asked to be a part of this panel, were you aware of the book, Gentleman in Moscow? Had you given any consideration to this? And if the answer is yes, then fine. How did you respond? If the answer is no, then what convinced you to be a part of this?
So I had actually listened to the very first part of the audiobook of this book, and I just kind of came across it randomly. I wanted to close out my Audible account, and I wanted to use up my credits, and I was like, oh, okay, that one. And to be honest with you, I listened to just a very little bit of it, and I was like, yeah, this is not for me. And then when y'all reached out to ask me to take part in this, I thought, you know what, that could be fun. And I read it and I really enjoyed it. And the biggest question that I was asking myself as I was reading it, and this is because I'm a huge nerd, is, you know, how is he engaging with Russian literature? That was kind of the big mystique for me. But
How'd he do?
Yeah. Well, he knows a ton, and I think he is really, really deft in the ways that he brings Russian literature into the work. One of the questions that I was asking myself, and maybe a lot of y'all as well, maybe some of y'all as well, was in particular, how is he engaging with Tolstoy, right? Because we see so many references throughout the novel to Anna Karenina in particular. That book is mentioned tons. We see lots and lots of other literary references. And so, you know, I was kind of thinking, like, is he trying to write an English language Russian novel? Is he trying to write a kind of Tolstoy novel for the current day? And I think my answer was ultimately no. I think he's being, if I may say, more playful than that. Tolstoy was many things. I don't know that he was especially playful. And maybe that's really unfair. I think a lot of lovers of Tolstoy would disagree with me. I'm more of a poetry scholar, but there were a couple of other figures who seemed a little bit closer to his approach than Tolstoy in certain senses. So I was thinking about, I thought a lot about Pushkin. And Pushkin is a name that probably most folks know, but probably many of us have not read him, right? He's known as Russia's most important poet. He writes love poetry. He writes poetry about friendship, writes political poetry, and he's most famous for writing Eugene Onegin. So I was thinking about that novel, which is actually a novel written in poetic form, because this fop from kind of dandy, from aristocratic dandy from St. Petersburg, inherits his family's estate and goes out to live in the countryside. And so I was thinking, you know, kind of what is the crossover here? The Count is really different in certain ways from Eugene Onegin. He's similar in that he has a duel. And you know, the sort of question of honor is a really big one that like Mike was talking about. but he's different in that for much of the work he's bored, and he doesn't know what to do with himself, which is obviously the opposite situation from the Count. I think a big difference with the Count and most heroes from the classic Russian novel, at least, is that he's really stable. And the kind of big thing about the Russian novel is like they incorporated the growing science of psychology into their writing. So as psychology was being developed as a science, as a field, these Russian authors were kind of taking those insights and writing them into their novels so that we could see into the interiors of people, how we think, how we feel, how we love, how we hate. And we do see a lot of the interior of the Count, but he's extremely stable. And I think that's one of the things maybe that draws us to this novel at a time like now, when there's so much change and instability. So ultimately I decided that, yes, the Russian literature is here, Russian poetry, I mean, it starts with a poem, right? But I actually decided that maybe the main novel is the American film noir, because there's that whole Humphrey Bogart thing, right? And there's this little passage at the almost the very end. Here was Casablanca, a far-flung outpost in a time of war, and here was the heart of the city. Right under the sweep of the searchlights was Rick's Café Américain, where the beleaguered could assemble for the moment to gamble and drink and listen to music, to conspire, console, and most importantly, hope. And at the center of this oasis was Rick. As the Count's friend had observed, the salon keeper's cool response to Ugarte's arrest and his instruction for the band to play on could suggest a certain indifference to the fates of men. But in setting upright the cocktail glass in the aftermath of the commotion, didn't he also exhibit an essential faith that by the smallest of one's actions, one can restore some sense of order to the world? And I think that's lovely. I'm kind of getting chills reading it over again. But, I'd say this is a novel of escapades. It's an adventure novel in a sense. But it's also about escape in literal ways, and also in the kind of escape that it gives to us. And I think American culture is good about escapist entertaining, producing escapist entertainment. And actually, I think that's a really great thing at this moment.
So American culture would be that. I was thinking as you were answering a couple of thoughts in regard, and I've got a couple of questions here from those who are joining us by chat, but this is my selfish questions first. I wonder if we read it in Russian, would it have felt differently? And then also, would a Russian novelist have written it this way? You just talked about certain things that maybe make me think that no, they would not. But, and I guess a third part to my question, and it's getting way too complicated, is were Russians, are they that interested in certain things like Humphrey Bogart and movies and American things? Is that an accurate setting of what might have been a topic of conversation between these two characters?
Yeah, and I'll try to be as brief as possible. I thought about that same question about what it would be like to read it in Russian. Ultimately, I thought I don't, this really feels like an English language novel about it, like an American novel. Mm-hmm. I kept thinking of Pushkin, because Pushkin writes, maybe he's known most as a poet, but he writes kind of romantic tales of adventure, and he has his tone varies a lot, but there can be a real lightness to his stories that we find here, and a kind of just kind of gentle, delightful pleasure, and that doesn't sum up his work, but he has that light touch that I think Immortals has. In terms of awareness, even within the Soviet Union, of all kinds of American culture, jazz, I think, comes up here. But one of the things that we begin to see, especially in the 20s in the Soviet Union, is that they want to create a Soviet mass culture, right? And so you actually see the growth of a Soviet film industry, and Lenin was like right in the middle of that. He wrote stuff about how important it was, and they had a kind of on one hand, Eisenstein, right? We have these kind of art films, experimental, but there was also this attempt to create ideologically pure, entertaining films to kind of bring the masses together and give them a shared identity. So there was a lot of attention to what was going on in Hollywood, and it's totally believable that the scene of watching Casablanca is totally believable to me.
Let me hit a couple of questions, and then we'll move back and get some reaction to anything we've talked about from Michael and from Chris Lawrence. One person early on said, I'm curious about the Russian history mentioned in the footnotes, the starvation in the Ukraine and the slaughter of livestock. Do you have a sense? I can open this up to anybody because maybe anybody on this panel has studied Russian history, and I don't want to lock anybody out. The obvious choice would be an associate professor of Russian studies, but are the historical references? I wondered the same thing as I was reading the novel, how I had a feeling that they were accurate. I thought the way that this novel is put together, he's done his work.
Very well researched. Yeah. I mean, I don't know that I would sort of add a lot to that, but I was impressed at how seriously he took this. Now, I'm not a historian, and a Russian historian may find something that I missed, but it seemed pretty on to me.
And then real quick from Diana, is the Count similar to Tolstoy in that Tolstoy admired the workers and wanted to fit in with them, but the Count actually does learn to fit in with the workers at the hotel?
That's a really great, astute question. So I would say Tolstoy had a much, much more complicated relationship to laborers, to former serfs and so forth. So he really believed it was better to be a peasant, and would kind of appropriate. Sorry, I'm on an HVAC system. He would appropriate their culture in ways that seem a little problematic, while all the while kind of holding power over them. And he had this complicated relationship with holding serfs, and feeling bad about that, but then not freeing them. And so I think the Count is a more savory character. I mean, of course, he's much more idealized. So.
We've delved into a whole lot of different topics there with Dr. Kelly, so I'll open it up to Chris Lawrence or Michael Trapp. Anything that we've said? I know, Michael, you've gone to the book a couple of times and gone through there. I didn't know whether there was something you were wanting to add.
No, I think Dr. Kelly's analysis was pretty astute. It does read like an American novel. I've read a fair amount of Russian literature, and he does touch on it, reference it, but it's escapist, you know. I have a friend who's a literature professor who was less enamored with the book, and I think it's you know, it's an accessible, it's an adventure novel. It is light, but I think Tol's had some real insight into the human condition, and that's what I get out of reading fiction, that kind of understanding and the touchstones that resonate for all humanity. So this was a passage that I like, that again I think kind of captures the homelessness experience, and also what he was dealing with so little to do and all the time in the world to do it. The Count's peace of mind to continue to be threatened by a sense of ennui, that dreaded mire of the human emotions, and something, a coping mechanism that also helps keep people down is living in the now. You know, that some people aspire for that, but and I wrote a little verse that kind of captured my thoughts on that, is don't go thinking about the past, it'll only make you bitter. Don't go thinking about the future, it brings the fear of winter. As you know, right now a project we have car camp, where we have monitored safer camping for people who live in vehicles and a support staff. And as we look at closing up our season, there were a lot of people who had kind of put their heart into it as their forever home, even though it's an abandoned warehouse and a parking lot. We built that same kind of community that we see in the hotel, of people engaged in a common activity, spending their days together, dealing with the vicissitudes of uncaring bureaucratic overseers, and they've really been doing some pre-mourning as they think about our season coming to an end and our community, because there's a transitoriness that we don't see in this novel, because the Count and much of the staff have these decades-long relationships in the same place, but I think there's some universals about how we deal with the confinement as it's a prescient pick, as we all spend our time on house arrest. Some of us get passes to get out for this and that. But most of us, who are doing the things right to manage this disease, are in virtual house arrest. And that weighs on us as we're pulled out of our normal routines.
I want to again say to those who are listening to us tonight, I know it's a little bit different. You're not there in person. You can't just ask questions with eye contact sometimes, or you'd raise your hand and we do your questions, but you can join us through a chat, and some people have, and that's where some of these questions are coming from. I want to go to Chris Lawrence, our licensed clinical psychologist. We have a question or a comment that came early in our conversation. I want to come back to you. I thought the psychologist would mention the thing I noticed first of all, which is what Michael Trapp just talked about, the entrapment in one place reminded me of exactly what we've gone through since March, also being confined to one inside place with coronavirus quarantining. It helped me identify with the Count. I think that was something I thought of immediately also, but then as I read the novel, it expanded so much that I didn't feel like I couldn't really relate to what I know. For example, I've been lucky enough, I still go to work. I don't have to stay at home. We've shut down a good portion of what we do at the radio station, but I've gone every day that I'm supposed to be at work. And so I don't have the same experience as some people maybe in New York have had with their apartment, and some other people even in this community. What thoughts came to your mind?
Well, that was when I was originally asked to be a part of this panel. That was sort of how it was presented to me as well, was this book might be something that you could speak to in terms of how we are all quarantined in one place. And so that's how I started the book, but I quickly moved past that because there's so much more to it. But I do think that there are ways in which the Count is better off than we are, and ways in which we are better off than he is. And the one thing that comes to mind to me about how he is better off is that he can engage with people and doesn't have to maintain distance, doesn't have to wear a mask. And that's, that wearing a mask and having distance from people that you care about is really debilitating and really difficult. And I've had lots of conversations with people about that. And it's one reason why I choose to work with my clients on telehealth, so that I can see their face and they can see my face. And I oftentimes, as I watch a movie or as I read this book, I'm jealous of the interactions that they're able to have without those barriers. But then we are, in a much different situation than him, in that we can go outside. And he couldn't even go outside. The only time he went outside was when he took Sophia to the hospital, and then when he ran away. And that would be really impactful on me and a lot of people if they had to live inside all of their life.
I want to say something that came to mind as Dr. Lawrence was talking about that. Dr. Kelly, before we got on with our panel discussion, we all were kind of just visiting and getting to know each other. You mentioned that you teach a couple of courses this semester, and one of them is an upper level Russian course that has 4 students. And you were mentioning how it's difficult to teach that kind of subject if you have half of your face masked up in person. Now you're doing it all remotely, but that picks up on what Dr. Lawrence was talking about, especially if I'm in a class where I think that I need the full face experience to be able to understand what's being communicated.
That's right. I mean, I think there's a lot of science and scholarship about how we learn language in community. We learn, I guess, really most things in community. And so on one hand, there's, we need to be able to see each other's mouths. That really helps. But I think one of the things that has been hard for this group is they've slogged through Russian for multiple semesters, and they know each other, and I think they, having to stay so far apart, we do a lot of pair and group work, and just the way that this has disrupted that sense of community in the ways that Dr. Lawrence is talking about. In a way, it moves us to the virtual platform. Well, the virtual platform can end up feeling kind of more intimate than when we can see each other's faces. We can actually, we're all seeing each other at the same time. There's nobody behind us, right? And you can have breakout rooms. And
I want to go back to Chris Lawrence for just a moment. As I was reading, I really liked the character of Nina and Sophia. I like both of those. But my question for you as a clinical psychologist, I have to, as the Count started the kind of relationship with Nina early in the book, I kept on telling myself, I think at that point in time, he might have been 32 or 33 years old with a young girl. And not that I thought anything untoward was going on, but at the same time, I'm thinking, holy cow, what kind of, how does this develop into this, relationship that made sense? I don't know if that needs psychological analysis or not, but I just thought I liked what happened, and I really liked the relationship with Sophia. But there was something about that I just kept telling myself, would that have really worked?
I saw him as an uncle. And so, and just an uncle who was really playful and who was willing to meet a child at her level. And so he was willing to go behind the scenes with her and, willing to climb places. And so, I, as somebody who loves working with children, I love reading about people who get it, that children have their own personality, their own dignity, their own way of looking at things, and really want to understand them. And you can see how well it worked because she brought her daughter to him. He was the person that she trusted the most in the entire world. So I didn't see anything untoward in it at all. He just took on the role of an uncle.
Yeah, and I would agree. I didn't think there was anything fishy going on there, but it was just,
yeah.
And can we really relate? But what I came to appreciate was the author's ability to really express what I think clever children.
Yes.
They are pretty sharp, and she was pretty sharp at times and had some really good.
Yes, she was very sharp. And then when Sophia came into his life and how studious she was and how he described her as, just very quiet and waiting expectantly for him to, step into that role as a parent. And I thought it was one of the scenes that was so funny was when, I can't remember who he was talking to, but he was telling someone, that she had kind of disrupted his life, but things were going to get back to normal and he was going to have his regular routine soon. And the other person was like, yeah, right. He didn't know what was coming, that his whole life would be wrapped around her.
One of the persons listening in and giving us this through a chat comment, forgive me if it's been discussed already, I'm late to the discussion. I felt like other stories of revolution or set during revolutions were subtly referenced. Les Mis was the main story that came to mind, also Hamilton and the Count of Monte Cristo. Anything that any of you would like to say in regard to that? We kind of have talked about the references to other things, but I like that. That's a good observation also. I don't know if anybody wants to answer that. Michael, I see you reaching for something, and Dr. Kelly, you're shaking your head. Michael?
I think the revolution is something that happens off the scene and then has some big impacts, but it's not as relevant to the day-to-day life in the hotel. And that captures us now. We have gone through the largest protest movement in the history of the United States. And it's had sweeping changes and attitudinal changes that are measurable across populations. and has led to some, small movements forward. But most of us have continued to live our lives at home or work and go about our business. And these things that are so momentous, pale besides the day-to-day friendships and what am I going to have for dinner and those kinds of real life kinds of things.
Well, I like that comment a lot because I was thinking about that also. As a reader, I kind of didn't like when they were getting into the history of the revolution and who was doing. I thought, don't interfere with my enjoyment of this novel with that. I want to see more of what's happening as the man is the father to Sophia and his relationship with Emile and the maitre d' and all of those. Dr. Kelly, do you want to add anything to this particular point?
I was really excited about this point because I got to co-teach a course this past spring, Revolution in Media in a Global Context. And so we looked at different ways that people have talked about revolution through the ages, and we looked at different revolutions and what's inspired them. And one of the things we ended up talking about a fair bit was that you have the revolution, but actually what's more interesting is what happens after the revolution, right? Because things have been overturned, and then what do you do with that? And so I totally agree with Mike that this is like, so much of this is happening in the background, but I also love the ways that it does trickle into this space and it affects people unevenly. And I think one of the neat touches of the novel is this friend Mishka, right? Whose actually poem begins the novel, even though it's just, listed as being the Count's. And we kind of see through those connections and through Nina, the effects of this aftermath of revolution.
Yeah, and one of the things that seemed like Amor Towles was saying was that after a revolution, those who are on the winning side of the revolution oftentimes fall into the same pattern as those who they revolted against in the first place. And I think that is something that people have to watch out for. We had a comment, somebody who was picking up on my questions about, was it realistic to think a 30-some-year-old man would have that kind of a friendship and go through so many escapades with that young girl. And it says, when you're shut down in a building, you're willing to talk to anybody who's willing to talk to you. I thought that was a good observation. Another observation from one of our listeners says the sense of community that existed from the characters in the hotel reminded this participant as Nomad Land, which I don't know if any of you have read that book, or that was one of our previous One Read books. Was that last year or the year before? I think it was last year. And Nomad Land is about a certain segment of the population, and Michael would understand this quite, because they're not homeless, but they are traveling around to seasonal jobs oftentimes and just living from job to job. Some of them work in Amazon warehouses, and some of them find jobs at amusement parks, and they basically live out of their cars or live out of their campers. And so that is kind of a confined living situation, but at the same time, the book also talked about the community that they develop through that confinement and through that travel. So I like that observation also. Let's see, am I missing anything? I think we've got most of the comments, and I'd say to those who are chiming in and want to chime in, go to the chat. We've only got less than 10 minutes left in our conversation. What else has struck you? I've kind of dominated the conversation here. I don't know whether any of you had questions or observations you wanted to share with each other. I try to leave that as an opportunity for panelists also.
I had a question for the other panelists and maybe especially for Mike. One of the things, and this kind of goes back to some of the things that folks have been already talking about, but one of the things I was thinking a lot about as I was reading this novel is the question of privilege, right? And power. And I wonder, and Mike, you talked a little bit about this when you were talking about even people without homes, and maybe especially what they have left is their honor, right? And they need to protect that because so much else has been taken away. How did you think about, or did you think about questions of power and privilege as you were reading this, and how does it relate to the folks you work with and what you witness in those communities?
Yeah. He's an aristocrat, and that gives him this sense of confidence and bearing and an ability to act upon circumstances, to shape events in a way that survives beyond the aristocracy. When we were talking to, when I was a radical political activist when I was a young man, and flirted with the ideas of revolution because of the deep inequities that have disturbed me growing up poor and seeing how the world is. But when I was reading Camus made the point that every revolution increases the power of the state. When you try to revolt and you don't win, then the state bolsters its powers of control. When, like in Russia, when you do win, then they end up creating state controls. And so that turned me into more of an evolutionist instead of a revolutionist, and to work on changing hearts as much as changing systems. Because, and I think, the Count shows that he didn't need the whole trappings of the aristocracy. It was these internalized things that he carried within himself. And so there's this level of that I've been, even though I grew up poor, as a white male and able to get an education, that gave me a sense of empowerment, a sense of the possibility of being someone who can change the world rather than be changed by the world. And I've kept that for, after I left my career type job and started working with homeless. I don't make very much money. I'm really a poor person myself, but I don't carry myself like that because of my network, my confidence, my ability to make change. And those are all great privileges. And sometimes that can be invisible, but it comes out in that novel. Quite well. He is different than a waiter, even if that's the career for what it turns out to be most of his adult life. He's an aristocrat, not a waiter.
I want to share.
I was curious to ask you, Dr. Oh, please.
No, go ahead. Go ahead, Michael.
Oh, I wanted to ask Dr. Kelly what she thought about the big twist of the novel, where the poem that saves his life because they see his revolutionary spirit instead of him being an aristocrat is written by his friend, and he could only publish it under his name because of that privilege of being an aristocrat to be able to critique the aristocracy.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great twist, and it ultimately made a lot of sense to me, and to me, it makes the novel feel more consistent to me and smart, because it doesn't really, I mean, there were actually plenty of aristocrats who did join the revolution. Well, maybe plenty is an exaggeration, but there were absolutely aristocrats who joined the revolution. So that didn't seem implausible to me. But then when you go along, when you notice all the things the Count says over the years, or indicates about his feelings about the regime, it feels a little fishy. So I liked that touch, and I think ultimately what that says to me is Amor Towles is really interested in the kind of old world aristocratic culture. There's something that he really wants to, there's a kind of atmosphere of that he really wants to suffuse his novel. And so I think he's true to that vision with that funny little twist there.
We are nearly out of our hour. I want to share some of the comments, and if anybody wants to comment on any of these, some of those go back to what Dr. Lawrence and I were talking about in regard to the young characters. One person has written, Kim says, I like that the revolution details and his relationships with Nina and Sophia act as timestamps to keep the reader grounded in the events of the outside world as the coming of age narrative unfolds. So I think that's a good observation. Another comment from Kathy says, we see Nina being lured into the early stages of the revolution at a young age and eventually becoming an activist. Eventually she is frightened for the safety of her daughter and indeed disappears herself. I thought that was a very sad part of the, when he made the comment and she was never heard of again. I found it frightening to parallel the early stages of the revolution with what we're seeing now. And another one says, I've just joined. Have you discussed the remarkable detail in the novel, from the gorgeous description of the wine cellar at the hotel to the changing number of squats that the gentleman does as he ages? I felt as if I were there in the hotel over time with him. I mean, I think that's what makes this novel so good. I like that part of the novel myself. Anybody with a comment about the details from this? I'll share some more here. Hang on. I really enjoyed the line, the quotation marks around "bloom where you're planted" aspect of Rostov's decision to seek employment at the restaurant and his participation in the triumvirate. I thought the beauty of the novel was its language, detail, and sense of community. And then also a paraphrase from one of our listeners and participants, Jerry, says, I'm paraphrasing, but one of the Count's statements was that if you do not master your circumstance, they will master you. I thought the book was a good reminder of make the most that you can out of what comes your way. And another observation, the bishop seemed to allow the story to introduce a singular flesh and blood antagonist, since the initial conflict is between Rostov and the revolutionists who sentenced him. And then one person wants to know, and this is a question that I'll need an answer to, are there any Russian restaurants in Como or in Missouri where we can try out the cuisine mentioned in the book? Somebody offered that there's a Russian store in Sedalia and a Russian restaurant in St. Louis, or at least there used to be. Anybody know of any Russian restaurants or places where we could eat Russian like they did in the book? I don't see anybody knowing where we have that or not. Well, let's get a final comment from all of our panelists. And I think that I went to Dr. Kelly last. So your final thought, anything that we haven't covered that you wanted to add here at the end?
No, I'm just excited to hear the things that other people notice. It's one of my favorite things about getting to teach is to getting to hear the reflections and experiences of everybody. So I'm done.
Well, thank you so much for your participation. We do appreciate what you brought to the discussion. How about Michael Trapp?
No, I think that was a great discussion. I love the reader comments, and the other panelists really gave some great insights. I'm sorry Mataka Askari wasn't able to join us. He's a real sharp guy with some powerful insights. If you get a chance to check out any of his stuff, he's worth pursuing. And it's been a big honor. Being one of the things about public life is getting to do these type of things, and being on a One Read panel has been on my bucket list. So it's good to see you, David, and I'm happy to have been asked.
Oh, I am thrilled that you were a part of that, because I knew you would add to it wonderfully. And Chris Lawrence, any final thought from you?
No, I really enjoyed the book, and I enjoyed the discussion. That's one thing about reading something or watching a movie is it's so fun to find out how other people react and if they notice the same things, and you always miss things. And so it was great to hear the readers' comments and what spoke to them as well.
All right, so a couple of final thoughts from participants. The cafe, I say Poland, and that's probably not how they say it if they wanted me to be authentic, but the Cafe Poland serves food very similar to some Russian foods. And somebody said, indeed, the borscht at Cafe Poland. So you might try that. And somebody wanted to know when I'll play back my interview that I was able to record last week with Amor Tolles. That'll be on Friday morning, right after 8:30, and that's at KFRU, which is 1400 AM and 98.9 FM. Panelists, thank you. You have helped me to see some things that I had forgotten and missed, and library, and those co-chairs, Lauren, Kat, Kirk, Eric, for helping out tonight. Thank you for letting me do this here rather than in my own house, because I would never have been able to set this up. So thank you all for including me again.
Thanks so much, David. And thanks again to all of our panelists. This was great. I appreciate so much you sharing your thoughts and insights, your expertise. Thanks again to David for moderating this, and thank you all for tuning in. With that, I'll go ahead and end this program. Thank you all. Good night.